Welcome, everybody. Dr. Angel Acosta here. Just really excited to spend a moment with Renee Lertzman, a colleague of ours who's been working in like the space of compassion-based education and climate. And I just want to really just welcome her with thunderous energy to our conference around capacity building. Renee, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Doing good. I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to you because climate, and you so much you've done so much work in other different fields, but when it comes to capacity building and our ability to cope with, adapt to the climate itself, but also the psychological um, and emotional aspects of a changing planet and how it shifts our relationship to space, to time, to politics. The ways that a lot of the changes in our climate have caused mass migrations, and how those mass migrations have caused a lot of political tension and economic tension, and just the interrelated issues that generates. So I just wanted to give the community an opportunity to hear from you about your work, what you've been up to, and your legacy.
Cool, thank you. Um, well, so since I was about 20, and I'm in my mid 50s now, um, so that's quite some time. I've been pretty singularly focused on this question of, what does it mean to be a human being today at this time? And specifically, what does psychology and human wisdom have to offer? And I say psychology and human wisdom because for me, I recognize that what we call psychology as a field, as a discipline, has its own complex history and origin. So it's not a blanket statement of psychology, because some psychology is better equipped than other schools of thought. But for me, it really comes down to, how do we evolve our psychological understanding and tools and resources that are commensurate with the nature of our variety of existential threats, and crises that we are navigating. To me, that's an intersection. It's like a Venn in a way. And so it started, years ago. I was a student at UC Santa Cruz in the late 1980s, and it was a very dynamic time. There was a lot of what's called cultural studies, which was really almost like what we're living out now, which was the kind of dismantling, blowing up, kind of shining a light on colonialism and, equity and like gender and race. Like that was in that period of time. And so I sort of was going through that as a young person. And then at the same time, learning about environmental studies, environmental sciences, about climate. And the confluence was such that I felt very strongly that we're not really leveraging the insights that we have access to, particularly in the kind of trauma-informed work, human sciences, and so forth. And so I started sort of making those bridges back then pretty early on. And that just led me to this whole journey, where I identify primarily as a communicator. So I'm a writer, I speak. That's just kind of my thing. And so for a while, I spent a lot of time looking at, this through a communications lens. And so I did a master's in communications, and I, was really looking at what's the psychology of how we communicate about charged, complex issues. And what I found over time is there's quite an array of really powerful perspectives and insights that maybe in sort of pockets of fields that have been more focused on different kinds of trauma and clinical work. But really the through line for me is bringing that in to really position confronting and being with climate, with inequity, with confronting our shadow as humans, really looking at that through that lens of compassion, which is where I think our work really intersects, and recognizing that there's conditions, just like with trauma-informed work, there are conditions that can support and enable us as humans to be with, what is so could be unthinkable, distressing, and what some colleagues of mine in the UK and the Climate Psychology Alliance call, difficult truths, or I call it unwanted, like what, information or insight that you don't necessarily want, but here we are, and we're having to confront it, and we're having to navigate through it. And so for me, it just keeps coming back to what can we learn and bring from those practices into new arenas that aren't clinical per se, but it comes back to those, what are those conditions? And, as you know very well, it has a lot to do with, what kind of containers are we fostering? What does it mean to create and foster spaces? And to me, this is 100% about capacity building.
Mhm.
Like this is the capacity building that I feel very committed and invested to.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, first of all, thank you for your work and for your the concentrated energy you dedicated to this, and I'm wondering just to kind of dive in a little bit into the anxieties that people have around climate. So, in your assessment right now, with the data that what's the picture in terms of, where we are? I know that there's been incredible work around planetary boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and just obviously the carrying capacity of Earth. So, what do you feel like are really important data points for people to know around climate, just to set that tone and set that just baseline?
Mm-hmm. Um, well, I can just speak very generally because I am not that person who really talks in terms of the science per se. I'm really oriented to high level that we've breached. We've breached the threshold of unleashing, extraordinary disruption and change in our world that we are heading into a period of time of tremendous change, ecologically, geophysically. We're heading into a time of there's going to be a lot of change, disruption, and all the things that I think we know now, drought and flooding and extreme weather and how this impacts the food system. And as you mentioned earlier, there's just this whole kind of it's a cascade of system impacts. So from that perspective, I feel that we're in a moment now of having to really come to terms with this.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot of energy being invested in how to come to terms with it. And that's kind of what I observe is right now it's kind of a noisy space of people kind of arguing for how to come to terms with this. And that would be, focus entirely on solutions and what's happening. That's really phenomenal, innovative, and impactful.
Mm.
There's, focusing on adaptation of, how do we be most prepared. So the kind of preparedness, um, and um, and then that kind of veers into, a perspective of anticipatory grief and creating processes where we can really be in that place of grief and mourning and being with the loss that has happened, that is happening, and that will be happening.
Mm.
And there's a bit of this kind of what I observe is this kind of ricochet movement, which makes a lot of sense because that's what we do as humans. We're always kind of trying to find where's that place that I can live and feel kind of coherent and okay.
Hmm.
And what I am really focused on here is really broadening that when what Dan Siegel, who I met at Garrison, um, the window of tolerance. So
Hmm.
how do we broaden that window of tolerance where we can be with the yes and of the disruption, the loss, the innovation, the imagination, the energy, the optimism, the hope, the grief, the anger, all of that we need to be able to really contain and process.
Hmm.
So that's kind of my roundabout way of responding to, what's
Yeah.
actually happening now is yeah, to me it's like I think we need to really be focusing on what are new ways of being with what is happening that
Mm.
are coming from that place of compassion-based work and trauma-informed work.
How do you make sense of and work with it's just climate denial? Because I hear you in terms of the capacity to hold the breaking of these thresholds that are going to have these really exponential effects. And I find myself really struggling with both developing the capacity to be with just
Hmm.
reality
Hmm.
around, where our industrial society has taken us and our consumer culture
Hmm.
and economy. And at the same time, kind of watching folks, the range of responses in terms of either climate denial. I've even seen folks who doubling down on like the um,
Yes.
positive effects of fossil fuel extraction.
Hmm.
So I see like there's two capacities within that. It's on the one hand meeting what is, and then also working with what folks are generating in terms of misinformation, disinformation, misunderstanding, sometimes even sheer manipulation.
Hmm.
So, any thoughts on
Hmm.
how you think about climate denial and the range of it, and
Hmm.
how that relates to the kind of capacity you're inviting us to really
Hmm.
develop?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you went there because that's where I was kind of going in my mind was what is this asking us to step into? And that's really has to do with how we be with what is. How do we meet reality? And so my work is influenced strongly by psychoanalytic research and what's called in the UK, there's more of a developed field called psychosocial research, which is
Mhm.
very psychoanalytically informed and as well as kind of in the more neuroscience side, which is all to say that the lens is primarily looking at the ways in which we have strategies for avoiding or being in adjacent to hard truths and difficult truths, defense mechanisms. And so denial, the way I relate to climate denial is through that lens of this is a defense mechanism. And how I relate to the whole domain of misinformation, of people really latching on to fiction with regards to making sense of the world, particularly when it's so threatening and deeply threatening on a profound existential level in terms of our identities, everything we thought to be, you know, true and real in the world. This is what humans tend to do when we don't have those conditions to feel safe enough to process. So the way I approach this is by I train people, particularly those working in the climate environmental space, to practice this compassionate attunement to what might actually be really going on underneath the denial. And
Mm-hmm.
I think even more important than denial is disavowal, which is, I think just a really nuanced more psychoanalytic term to say you're choosing not to know, but you're not necessarily saying, well, this cup isn't real. I'm choosing not to pay attention to this because I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to. So one of the ways of meeting that is by going underneath. And I have a framework I've developed that's very, very simple, which is called the 3 A's:
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, ambivalence, and aspiration. And
Mm-hmm.
what I find is very simplistic, but it's kind of like a decoding. Okay, what anxiety might be mobilized in relation to looking at our energy, looking at climate, looking at all of that, loss of identity, fear of, losing security or, whatever that might be. And ambivalence is really important because it really speaks to where many, many people feel legitimately in double binds and pulled in competing directions, conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's aspiration, which is, all the things we know that like, we aspire to be safe, secure, belonging, valued, all that stuff. And so if we have that lens and we really tune in, then that really helps us get underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was able to practice this a number of years ago when I was engaged to work with a Republican advisor who at the time was commissioned by a uh, private philanthropist to do a significant body of work on climate messaging specific for the GOP. And that was in 2015. And we went out and did these interviews with Republican climate deniers, or what the Yale Center on Climate Communication calls climate skeptics. And there were hard and soft skeptics. So talked to both of those sets. I trained his team to do this kind of psychosocial approach to the interviews as opposed to the usual message testing interview, which can be pretty aggressive. Like, do you like this word or that word? Do you resonate with this or that? This was like, tell me about what comes up for you when I say the word, And so we did these deep listening sessions, then created some scripts that acknowledged those 3 A's, and then did a message test with focus groups around the US. And we're able to see in real time what people were resonating with. And it was just pretty mind-blowing because we're talking about climate skeptics. And what we did in that 2-minute script was acknowledge those 3 A's. You're probably feeling really angry that all the solutions that are being put forward involve more government. You must be feeling really patronized and left out of the conversation. You must think Al Gore is some sort of hypocrite flying around the globe telling people to do what he's not able to do. So we literally named what they told us in the interviews, and then we could see the resonance going up. And then we did the flip of, well, what if we were to tell you that we could address climate change on your own terms with innovation, ingenuity, and all the things that Americans are known for. And then the very last word was without compromising the needs of those most vulnerable. And we ended in the 90s out of 100 of that 2-minute script. So that's like a real data point of what happens when we take the time to listen and attune and then reflect it back. That's what I'd like to see emulated in the movement. And I don't mean just one-on-one conversations. I mean like as a messaging strategy.
Yeah. Wow. So anxiety, ambivalence, and aspirations.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, as we wrap up the conversation, just want to spend a little bit with just one last maybe commentary from you around how, because I think that's for me, that's the gift of your work, um, is, thinking about capacity building through that kind of framework. That's really juicy. So, any thoughts on how, we as, leaders, individuals, educators in the field could really lean on that methodology in this moment, to address, climate, and build our capacity for what's coming?
Hmm. Well, I think it's vital to build literacy
Mm,
in the psychology and the science of how humans process charged, complex, and difficult truths and information.
mm,
And that's all I'm doing is doing that translation. And it's a literacy.
mm,
It's looking at how when, based on the affect, whether it could be fear or shame or guilt or conflict or whatever might be aroused, that actively impairs and influences our cognitive processing, right? And so when it comes to capacity building, I feel very strongly that what we can be doing is building this literacy and understanding that and situating existential threat as a kind of domain of, it's a form of trauma. I mean, I don't want to overuse that term, but what I'm doing with the three A's is I'm attempting to do an intervention on the
mm,
tendency we have to take
mm,
at face value what people are saying and doing, and
mm,
basically saying we need to go much deeper than that, and we have a responsibility to go deeper than that. It's not people don't care. It's not that they're just stupid, I mean, there are those things too, ignorance and all of that exists, but often we have to go underneath and say, well, what actually is going on? And coming from that heart-centered, compassion-based place,
mm,
say, wow, like, okay, clearly there's something going on here.
mm,
And what might those three A's be? And how can we really practice naming and speaking and evoking? A lot of my work is informed by motivational interviewing in the
mhm,
public health space. And so it's really based on that premise of evoking versus telling.
mhm,
And so, again, I feel like the opportunity we have here with regards to capacity building is precisely kind of really including this literacy of what that means. What does that involve,
mm,
to do that and to notice and kind of hold ourselves accountable for the default assumptions of labeling of like they
mhm,
as opposed to us. We are in a moment.
mhm,
How can we, you know, skillfully foster those conditions for
mhm,
more safety? So that's, and I feel like we have so much we can be drawing from because as it happens, this is a very dynamic time when it comes to understanding the human.
mhm.
Like it's rapidly evolving in ways we just can't even imagine, just as in terms of understanding consciousness and a more non-material approach to the mind, to the brain. Like, really, we're just in this incredibly dynamic time. So
Mhm.
let's draw on all of that wisdom and insight as best we can right
Yeah.
now.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your insight and your work. Just really looking forward to the community being able to hear your contribution.
Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. My pleasure.